Thank you all so much for joining us on today's webinar, 10 Years of the Maryland Traditions Archives. We are very excited to be celebrating this anniversary with you all and by sharing with you some of the exciting things that have happened over the past decade with our wonderful panelists. My name is Ryan Coons, and I am Folklife Specialist at the Maryland State Arts Council, the hosting institution of this afternoon's webinar, and I have the privilege of overseeing the Maryland Traditions Archives from the MSAC side. I'm joined by my colleague, Lorena Ojo-Higuare, who is processing archivist at UMBC, who will be also co-hosting with me. And our panelists, we are very excited to have them joining us, and we will introduce them to you in a few short moments. As hosting institution, we at the Maryland State Arts Council like to begin all of our public-facing media and content and meetings with a series of grounding slides, both to introduce ourselves to you, many of whom are our constituents, and also to make sure that everyone's technology is working. We are using Google Meet this afternoon, this evening, this morning, depending on where you're coming in from. I know that there are so many different platforms out there for folks to use, and each one is a little different. This is a reference shot of those features, and I'd like to draw your attention to the microphone on-off toggle here. It'll be kind of in the center left of your screen. If you're not actively speaking, we do ask that you keep that microphone off so that we can get a better audio recording. And I'd also like to draw your attention here in the second reference shot. In the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you will notice the chat. Unlike certain other communication platforms where you can chat privately with other individuals, all chat is public and everyone can see it. So do please keep that in mind. If you encounter any tech issues with Google Meet, there is in the center right of the bottom of your screen a little icon of 3 vertical dots. For more options, click that and fiddle around with the audio and the video options so that you are able to see, hear, and or see captions if that is something that is of use to you. Please note that captions are automatically generated and sometimes can produce inaccurate and sometimes hilarious content, so we apologize for that in advance. We'd like to begin, as I said, all public-facing meetings of the Maryland State Arts Council with a series of grounding slides, and I will begin with our land acknowledgement statement. This derives from the MSAC Land Acknowledgement Project, which I had the privilege of administering, a publicly requested project in which staff consulted with and paid tribal communities for their time in order to create an online resource, which you can find on our website, msac.org, under the Resources tab. And following the best practices of accessibility, I will read this and the subsequent slides aloud. We acknowledge the lands and waters now known as Maryland are the home of its first peoples, the Accohannock Indian Tribe, Assateague Peoples Tribe, Cedarville Band of Piscataway Indians, Choctaw Band of Indians, Lenape Tribe, Nanticoke Tribe, Nassau-Wawash Band of Indians, Piscataway Conoy Tribe, Piscataway Indian Nation, Pocomoke Indian Nation, Susquehannock Indians, Yakagani River Band of Shawnee, and tribes in the Chesapeake watershed who have seemingly vanished since the coming of colonialism. We acknowledge that this land is now home to other tribal peoples living here in diaspora. We acknowledge the forced removal of many from the lands and waterways that nurtured them as kin. We acknowledge the degradation that continues to be wrought on the land and waterways in pursuit of resources. We acknowledge the right of the lands and waterways to heal so that they can continue to provide food and medicine for all. We acknowledge that it is our collective obligation to pursue policies and practices that respect the land and waters so that our reciprocal relationship with them can be fully restored. MSAC's Equity and Justice Statement is the arts celebrate Maryland's diversity, connect our shared humanity, and transform individuals and communities. The Maryland State Arts Council and its supporting collaborators are committed to advancing and modeling equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion in all aspects of our organizations and across communities of our state. MSAC and its grantees are committed to embracing equity and non-discrimination regardless of race, religious creed, color, age, gender expression, sexual orientation, class, language, and or ability. MSAC's vision is that it plays an essential role ensuring every person has access to the transformative power of the arts. And our mission is that we advance the arts in our state by providing leadership that champions creative expression, diverse programming, equitable access, lifelong learning, and the arts as a celebrated contributor to the quality of life for all the people of Maryland. Our current strategic plan, created in 2019, has 5 strategic goals. I will allow you to read the non-bolded print, and I'll just read these 5 bolded print goals. They are to increase participation, to provide intentional support, to build capacity, to leverage connections, and to bolster Maryland arts. We invite you today and going forward to engage with us in this series of creative meeting actions, to celebrate being in the space with other creative people, to engage with everyone's presence as a gift, to acknowledge that together we know a lot, to enter the conversation with curiosity and inquiry, to share your idea and trust that it will be heard, to use I statements such as I think or I feel or I remember, to focus on the task at hand, to hold one another accountable with care, to apply yes and, as in, I hear your idea and I'm going to add to it, and to balance speaking and listening. The Maryland State Arts Council makes available a variety of professional development opportunities, and most of them are available through MSAC's Eventbrite page. By virtue of the fact that you are here participating in our webinar today, you have found that Eventbrite page, which is wonderful news. We also, in addition to events like today's webinar, have a variety of other topic-specific sessions, for example, on financial management, on legal advice, on marketing strategies, strategic planning, many other things as well. You can find more information about them on our Eventbrite page, on our email, on our website, msac.org. And also, if you have not already, we recommend signing up for our email listserv, which you can access by tinyurl.com/MSAC's mailing list. That's /MSACS mailing list. For those of you who are joining us who are Maryland residents, and unfortunately only Maryland residents, we invite you to participate in a variety of the ways to get involved with us. These include, for example, doing paid work for MSAC as panelists, scoring applications and nominations, editors improving our program policies, coaches, and so on and so forth with our various programs. You can find more information about these public calls at msac.org under the About menu under Ways to Get Involved. And I will note that almost all, if not all of these ways to get involved with MSAC are paid opportunities. And we are very fortunate to be able to provide some of the highest compensation rates in the country. We're very pleased of, especially in these days of rampant inflation. And without further ado, I'm going to provide you a brief overview of our roadmap this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you're coming into with us. We're going to start with a history of the Maryland Traditions Archives, not the Maryland Traditions of Maryland Transportation Authority, but the Maryland Traditions Archives, different MTA, and then I will introduce today's panelists. And Greg C. Adams will be moderating a discussion among our panelists. And at the very end, we will transition into a Q&A with you, our good audience. So if you have questions, please feel invited to place them into the chat as we go along, or plan to unmute and ask your question at the end during that Q&A. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to Lorraine.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good night, good morning. So UMBC is the designated repository for the Maryland Traditions Archive, or as we call it here, the MTA, which contains materials dedicated to the folk and traditional arts across the state of Maryland. In order to cast a wide net to represent and collect across the state, we collaborate with the following regional folklife centers: Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, Common Ground on the Hill, Creative Alliance, Frostburg State University, Sandy Spring Museum, St. Mary's College of Maryland, the Ward Museum, and us as another kind of satellite location for collections. Currently, the MTA has more than 20 unique collections under its umbrella and is only growing as we approach our collections donors, tradition bearers, and content creators with a shared stewardship model that truly defines the considerations and needs to collaborate and understand the relationships between the archival institution, the creators or community members, and the archive or the materials in and of themselves. Slide. Here is a list of the collections that we currently have at UMBC. As you can see, each regional folklife center has its own collection. Since 2021, we've established a workflow that allows each folklife center to keep their physical collections, if they so choose to, on their on-site location for the local community to use, and for any program planning or any sort of creative sort of projects that would surround and support the Folklife Center collection. As for the collections that are physically housed at UMBC, we reference and use these collections for various teaching opportunities, gallery exhibitions, research assistance. For example, the Left Bank Jazz Society was featured in a research collab, which you'll hear about today. Olabelle Reed's collection was the focal point for a semester-long gallery exhibition at UMBC and accompanied with outreach activities and a musical concert. Ashley Minner, another collection that you'll hear more about today, along with Charles Weygant II's collection, both had funded internships for graduate students, among many other projects that we facilitate in the archive. Slide. Since the establishment of MSAC in 1967, there have been many great strides in the progress that we know now as the Maryland Folklife Network and Maryland Traditions Archive. Through the years of collaborations and collecting, the Maryland Traditions Archive has not only grown in size, but in diversity and captured traditions, and has embraced and emphasized the need to formally archive the process and importance of many folk and traditional arts as we can. Slide. And so to access these collections or to add to the collections, whatever you will, peruse, you can access the MTA by visiting either the first hyperlink, which would take you to the MD Folklife at UMD website, which will direct you to special collections where we house the collections, give you a little bit of background, and allow you to view the finding aids that we have created so that folks can find an inventory of the detailed materials that we host in the archive. The second QR code is for a UMBC supported LibGuide or library guide that also helps you kind of navigate the lay of the land of folklife in Maryland generally, but also our specific folklife collections. Gives you more background on the establishment of the program and related resources. And back to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. We hope you will enjoy these materials we've got available for you by these QR codes. And our colleague Beth Saunders, who is head and curator of the special collections at UMBC, has just pasted the links into the chat for your more easily accessing. Thank you very much for doing that, Beth. Very excited to introduce you to our panelists in today's webinar. I will introduce each of them, and then they will each share with you a brief, some information on the ways in which they are connected to the materials in the Maryland Traditions Archives. First up is Earl H. Brooks, who is a musician and assistant professor of English at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He teaches courses in sound studies, African American rhetorical traditions, media literacy, rhetorical theory, and composition. His forthcoming book, entitled On Rhetoric and Black Music, which will be published by Wayne State University Press this June 2024, examines how Black music functions as rhetoric, considering its subject not merely reflective of, but also central to African American public discourse. Earl's work, has also appeared in Sounding Out, Rhetoric Review, Journal for the History of Rhetoric, Langston Hughes Review, and College Composition and Communication. Earl is a recent winner of the 2023 UMBC College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences Early Career Excellence Award. Welcome, Earl.
Thank you. And I just want to say I really am so happy to take part in this panel. And I'm so grateful for the role that the Maryland Traditions Archive has played in allowing me and my students to access a wonderful collection of materials from the Left Bank Jazz Society. If you've never heard of this group, this was a group that was began in the 60s and was one of the rare racially integrated organizations that was dedicated to the sole purpose of celebrating jazz and bringing their community together. It's a really incredible story. It's a really wonderful historical case study in what people were doing during what we consider, a really tumultuous time in American history. So these archival materials allowed me to make history really accessible for my students in a way that would not happen with just using textbooks or, working with, just secondary, materials that we commonly use in a classroom setting. But I want to make three things really clear in terms of why I'm such a huge supporter of using archival materials in a classroom setting. The first one is that it increases buy-in from students, right? And that's really important because it makes the stakes of what we're studying really clear and transparent. The second thing is that these kinds of historical documents and materials can better communicate nuance and in a way that I never could just alone as an instructor, right? And then the third thing is that these materials can serve the purpose of pushing students out of the more typical passive stance they take as just receivers of knowledge in a classroom where, the instructor or the teacher has the knowledge and they just sit back and kind of receive. Instead, these materials can allow students to become co-creators of knowledge. And it really is a much more efficient way of garnering their critical thinking skills. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause and pass it to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Earl. Our next panelist is Tiffany Chavis, a member of the Lumbee American Indian community, who is an outreach and education librarian for the network of the National Library of Medicine, Region 1, located in the Health Sciences and Human Services Library at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. She has also been working on archival projects focusing on Indigenous identity and description at other local universities, including University of Maryland College Park and UMBC, which we'll hear a little bit more about today. Tiffany holds a bachelor's degree in social work with a minor in women's studies from UMBC, a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and a master's degree in library and information sciences from the University of Maryland College Park. She previously worked as a licensed clinical social worker for over a decade. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me, and I'm so happy to be here. So to tell you a little bit more, for me, this journey started for me when I first saw an article that was published in a Smithsonian magazine back in October 2020. And it was about the work and the research that Ashley Minner was doing about the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina and Baltimore. And I saw that she checked into this presentation. So this is how I discovered that there was a Lumbee archive, or what's now called the Ashley Minner collection at UMBC, and that it was in the works. At the time, I was a student in the MLIS program at University of Maryland College Park. So, and I was also interested in archives, and I was in need of an internship. So as soon as I read the article, I reached out to Ashley and I asked if she needed some assistance. And thankfully, yes, she did. And I got to work with Lorraine here, and I got to work with Bev. So it turned out to be a great experience. So through that work, I was the first to start working on this collection. I started with a survey of the collection, and then I moved on to write a processing plan. I conducted research and wrote the front matter for the finding aid, and I provided a file level description for the collection. By no means is it complete, but I put a nice little dent in there. So I also wrote an outreach plan, which was utilized to plan the upcoming Community Digitization Day that is being held at the Baltimore American Indian Center in Upper Fells Point this weekend on April 6th. So we all know it's no secret that there is a lack of diversity in the fields of librarianship and archival work. In archives, it's mainly culturally homogeneous. The majority of the professionals in libraries and archives are white, Caucasian. a lot of what we find in libraries and archives related to BIPOC communities or stories told by outsiders looking into these communities. So, you know, when I started working on this, I knew I was working on you know, a special collection. I knew this would be a unique opportunity. Not only did I have the privilege to be a part of telling a story that many are unaware of, but as a Lumbee myself, I was able to help tell the story of my people and my story. So while processing the collection, I even found photos of my grandmother, Dorothy Chavis, along with other familiar faces from the community that I grew up around. So I did grow up in Baltimore City and Fells Point, Upper Fells Point area, which is a focus area. And I had many Lumbee family members in that same community all over Southeast Baltimore, yet at the same time, I know what it's like to have somebody, you know, look at me in the eyes and not only misidentify me, but tell me what they think I am and what I'm not. So this collection lends the opportunity to remind people that we are still here, you know, there are still natives in the area, and that the Lumbee community has contributed and that we continue to contribute to the history and culture of Baltimore City and the state of Maryland. So, but thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Our next panelist is Jenifer Dolde, who is Director of Curatorial Affairs and Exhibitions at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, as Lorraine mentioned earlier, a regional folklife center whose collection is represented in the MTA. A writer and historian, her work focuses on interpreting the material, culture, and traditions of rural and maritime Delmarva through exhibitions. She fell in love with history, exploring graveyards, frequenting local historical society archives, and talking with elders in her hometown. Jen received her bachelor's degree in English and history from Washington College and master's degree in history and museum studies from the University of Delaware. Previously, she was curator at the Delaware Agricultural Museum and Village, an oral historian, and a museum consultant. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, it's just great to be here today because I will say that exploring archives, as you heard, was really my first and greatest love from the time I was a young teenager. And oral history and storytelling have really been integral to my work, driven by my own connections and deep roots in this community on the Eastern Shore. But in our role, and it lends itself very nicely to my work here at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. We're a nearly 60-year-old cultural organization. We have a 20-acre museum campus on the Miles River in St. Michael's. And as Ryan mentioned, we've been a Folklife Center since 2020. And really that has solidified what we were already doing to preserve Maryland traditions through not only exhibitions, but also programming and collecting in many of the same ways that the Maryland Tradition Archives collects. As a museum, we hold lots of material culture objects of use, boats, of course, decoys, tools and equipment of the watermen, like split oak oyster baskets, folk art that includes things like sailor-made models. I could go on and on. We have more than 85,000 items in our collection. Many of them are photographs, and I would hazard a guess that well more than a quarter would be considered folklife collections. We also have traditional archive collections, so folklife texts, memoirs, anthropological research, records of traditional occupations and music traditions, and also a really rich collection of oral histories, more than 500 unique to us, and that include Lila Line's groundbreaking work interviewing water women in the 1980s. And finally, we have a working shipyard that preserves these traditional skills on a daily basis, a state-accredited apprenticeship program, and lots of educational programs that help perpetuate those skills as well. And so, Maryland traditions are a key part of our mission and interpretation. It's included in our exhibitions, special exhibitions like our recent one that was a community response exhibition. People invited to create art in response to cultural environmental change they see in the region. And we got a wide range of folks who participated and responded to that. And also an exhibition that was very new for us, based on a series of oral histories that I did about the build of the Maryland Dove at legendary boat builder Jim Richardson's yard outside of Cambridge. Both men and women who built that vessel. And the first time we really used narrators' voices as the main thread in our exhibit script rather than a curatorial voice, and it was received very well. We also host a whole array of programming featuring the traditional arts, you know, from waterfowling practices to things like net making and net mending. I could, you know, say more. Foodways and presentations and panel events by community historians and tradition bearers, which we record and add to our archive as well. And our work, as I said, in many ways does parallel what the Maryland Traditions Archive does. We do inventory and submit a record of what we hold to MTA, but we do hold on to that responsibility to preserve them as part of our public trust, our work as a folklife center, as a museum. And thus, as we will discuss, we face some of the same challenges in making our collections accessible, making them more diverse, and most of all, hoping that they get used by the wider community. So thank you all again for having me.
Thank you so much, Jen. Our next panelist is Angel Rivera, who was originally from Puerto Rico and settled in Maryland with his wife and 2 daughters after completing a career in the Navy. His passion and practice of Puerto Rican traditions motivated him to found Cultura Planera in 2011 and Puerto Rico Distillery in 2017. Cultura Planera is a nonprofit organization dedicated to community building through the musical and dance traditions of bomba and plena. And located in Frederick, Puerto Rico Distillery has the distinction of being the only legal producer in the United States of Puerto Rican moonshine rum known as pitorro. Angel is a champion of these and other Puerto Rican cultural expressions in Maryland and a recipient of the 2024 Maryland Heritage Award. Welcome, Angel.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to join the rest of the participants in sharing their experiences. As you mentioned, so I am really coming at this from a bearer of several traditions, residing in Maryland and finding that the state of Maryland was very welcoming to our traditions was one of the ways that I found myself feeling like I found a home that I can actually claim, right, outside of living in Puerto Rico. The traditions that Cultura Planera practices and the tradition of a moonshine preparation are oral traditions, right? And one way that the Maryland Traditions Archive has really enhanced our ability to have those traditions known to the communities that we serve are through the documentation of those traditions. We don't really have on the Cultura Planera side a actual physical location. We host many events throughout the state where our community gathers, they experience the traditions, and then everybody goes home, right? Having the opportunity to document those traditions and then for them to reside in the archives provides us the ability to connect what we're currently doing in Maryland with everything that we've done so far in those traditions. Bomba is a tradition that's been around for more than 300 years. Plena is a tradition that's been around for more than 100 years. And so is the tradition of moonshining. Having those be available in the Maryland Traditions Archive allows us to be able to work with other folks that are interested in those traditions and having them see that those resources exist. They provide a representation of those traditions in Maryland. So the archives is a place where we continuously point the organizations that are looking at us to see how we're actually executing our programming, for them to understand what we're doing, how we're doing it. And we're so grateful to have the opportunity to have our material there. We're really looking forward to using it to expand our offering and having the community at large be able to see that the Maryland Traditions really is embracing not only the traditions that have been in Maryland since basically the creation of the state, but people like us, right? People that have come to the community and are bringing their traditions with them and are practicing those traditions in the state of Maryland and are actually making those traditions part of the tapestry that is the arts and the cultures and the traditions that are practiced in Maryland. So I want to really encourage anybody that's listening to this webinar that would like to know how we are leveraging it and how we're actually executing our programming and how we've actually been able to expand and take off our programming through the amazing support of MSAC and MPA to reach out to us. Cultura Planeta at Gmail, and we'll be more than glad and happy to really help others the way we've been helped. So yeah, with that, I pass it on to the next participant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angel. And for those of you who are joining us on the webinar today, as opposed to seeing it on the recording later, I did just place the link to Cultura Planeta's website into the chat. And last and certainly not least is our final panelist and moderator for this afternoon's or this morning and this evening's discussion, Greg C. Adams, who is an archivist at the Ralph Rinsler Folklife Archives and Collections at the Smithsonian Institution's Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. His work focuses on the preservation, processing of archival collections, and providing records management support for staff. He holds a bachelor's degree in music history from Youngstown State University and master's degrees in library and information sciences and ethnomusicology from the University of Maryland, College Park. Greg's ethnomusicological work is grounded in critical heritage research and programming focused on the multicultural history of the banjo. And I will welcome Greg and also turn this presentation over to him for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and to our other panelists. It's great to be here with all of you today, not just as the moderator, but also as an extension of my own experiences with the Maryland Traditions program. My introduction to Maryland Traditions began in 2008 when I got to serve as a folklife apprentice to the great Malian Ngoni player Sheikh Amala Jabate. And then through my long-standing collaborations as part of the greater banjo community, I had the chance to co-curate an exhibit about the regional history of the banjo at the Baltimore Museum of Industry, thanks to a 2014 Maryland Traditions Project grant. And then in my work as a professional archivist and as a consultant from 2011 to 2014, I also had the chance to work as part of a collaborative team to lay the groundwork that eventually brought the Maryland Traditions Archives to UMBC. And since then, it's been great, in essence, to really keep in touch, to keep the archival dialogue going between our respective institutions as we collaborate in new ways to increase the accessibility of collections and resources to those very communities whose cultures are documented in the collections that we steward. So with all of that, let's keep things moving. And next slide, please. So today's discussion will be centered around 4 questions that each of our panelists have considered. Questions that will help us define the cultural value of archival documentation, what it means to build trust, share authority, and identify the barriers to be overcome as we advocate for the resources and practices that can help people connect with the Maryland Traditions Archives. And so with that, taking a closer look at the first question, what is the cultural value of the archival materials held by the MTA to source communities? And if it's okay with our panelists, I'd like to ask Tiffany to begin.
Sure thing. So obviously it's the preservation of history and cultural traditions. That's a huge value of this collection. But as with many cultures and peoples, our elders, they're passing away, unfortunately. It happens to all of us. We get old and we die. But with them, they're taking this cultural knowledge with them in a lot of cases, and we've seen it through all communities. MTA can help preserve memory and the traditions of communities across Maryland that have not been the focus of traditional archives. So for example, to this day, many people have no idea that there is a thriving American Indian community in Baltimore. Most people think, American Indians are a thing of the past, or maybe they all live on reservations, or maybe they just all live out west somewhere. But really, it's 70% of American Indians that live in urban areas across this country. Having this archive and working with members of the community lends an opportunity to, again, we're telling stories. We're telling a story that may not have been told the same way as someone else looking in this case, the community is not just a subject, but we're teachers. We're getting to tell others about, our ways of life and our traditions. So that's important. I still run into people that have no idea that there's Indians in Baltimore, which I don't know, is crazy to me, but.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Sure.
Angel, can we turn the question over to you?
Absolutely. So for me, the value is documenting the continuity of the tradition, right? Traditions that have been practiced for hundreds of years, to have people understand that they are being practiced now, by documenting the fact that they're here, and also documenting the expansion of those is very important to our organization. These traditions that we practice have been practiced in Puerto Rico for hundreds of years, but it's only been since really Puerto Rico has been part of the United States after 1898 that Puerto Ricans have the Puerto Rican diaspora has expanded to the United States, and it still surprises a lot of people that bomba, plena, and pitorro are actually practiced in Maryland, and the documenting those in the archives provides the documentation, the proof that is actually happening here in the state of Maryland.
Excellent, thank you. And Earl, we'll turn it over to you.
Sure, I agree with everything that has been said, and I'd only add one of the things that I love about these archival materials is that they provide really, really valuable counter stories to some of the more commonly told narratives that we, kind of receive as, students coming up about what's happened, in our historical past. So, one of the big things that I try to emphasize to students when I use these materials is that often we think of some of these really pivotal moments in American history around racial integration, like, the Brown versus Board of Education case, the racially integrated schools, or some of the other cases related to the military or to the workplace. But some of the first spaces that became racially integrated had to do with entertainment and music. They were concerts, they were, shows. And so these spaces, although it's easy to kind of ignore them as ephemeral or as things that weren't as important. But these really were very important spaces for communities to come together in very difficult times. And so just in those simple examples are ways that it really broadens and deepens and enriches history for many students.
Thank you. And Jenifer.
Yes, if I could pick up on some of the threads I've heard from the other panelists. I mean, I think that, if we take the example of, the Watermen of Maryland, there's a lot of nostalgia, misplaced nostalgia and tradition associated with that. And in a well-built archive, we have the opportunity to really diversify the story of that tradition. But the other aspect of that is that change has been ever present. So there's both continuity and change, for example, in that story. And we need to dispel that nostalgia. We need to change the idea of how this tradition was practiced, and also that we're making room for new stories, and that there are people who are coming to Maryland who are practicing and engaging with the fisheries in new ways. So that's one of the things that an archive can do. And I also want to expand the notion of an archive to once again bring in material culture, the value in preserving, and I know that the Maryland Traditions Archive does have a select number of physical objects as well. When we're talking about objects of use that become evidence of folk life. These are things that are used up and that are in danger and at risk of being lost. There was a beautiful eel pot there on one of the slides earlier. And if we aren't preserving things like this and are not only losing the story of that aspect of life and how it was practiced, but also the beauty and the creation of the object and the functionality of the object itself. So there's so many aspects of what's in an archive that are vital.
Thank you, everybody, for that. As I continue to reflect on the answers you provided so far, ranging about the importance of preservation and not only how do we engage with the past, but how are we actively documenting the right now, whether we're talking about looking historically at pivotal moments, or how do we interrupt the ways in which nostalgia can maintain separate points of separation, and how do we make those transformative changes? And thinking about that, a lot of that brings up issues of how do we work together? How do we build trust between institutions and communities? So looking in particular at our second question, and Jenifer, maybe we'll continue the question with you, but how do we build trust between institutions and source communities to ensure that communities share that curatorial authority over how those archival materials are being stewarded, and in this case, with the Maryland Traditions Archives?
Yeah, for sure. And we've learned that building trust and collaboration takes time. It can begin with a single connection, an invitation to participate in a program or an exhibition, making our site available, or something as simple as asking to record someone's story and honoring what they are sharing, the value of that with stipends. But one of the things museums in particular here in survey data and from our community is that people really want to see themselves in exhibitions, to see their stories told. That's it at a very surface level. But furthermore, what we've come to know and is that they want to be engaged in deciding what stories are important enough to be told. And that work and that is essential. Building that trust is essential to making that work. And so, I think it happens with those small connections. It happens with a project. We're very fortunate here at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum that we have, lots of avenues to do that. We're only, I think, limited by the time and giving honor and respect to taking that time to get to know people before we proceed with a collaboration.
I think that's really significant, and it makes me think about some of the things that Earl, that you were saying about making those connections with students. Might we pass this question over to you at this point? Oh, you're muted, Earl.
Sorry about that. Some of the things that I've encountered in the classroom is, instances where, students have, they don't even know that they can access archival materials. They've never encountered things like this before. So it can be a really radical experience to introduce students to primary, source materials, and actually allow them to form their own opinions, to really kind of work critically with the material and not just rely on things that I'm telling them, And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's such a great way for breaking students out of this kind of passive sense of themselves as, we're just going to take this class and just, memorize whatever the information is that we get and then regurgitate it on a test. And bringing archival materials in can really just break students out of that mold and allow them to really be in the driver's seat in terms of like, here's some material and here's what we're going to do. And we're going to try and make something that's really authentic, that respects the community that we're engaging. And that's going to allow you to really think critically about how we're going to navigate all of these things. And so I found that to be really, really empowering for students, and it really just kind of raises the stakes for what we're trying to do. It's also been a great way to allow folks in the community to have access and interact with students. When we did the Left Bank Jazz Society, we were able to connect with one of the few surviving members who was a living board member with this group. His name is John Fowler. And that was just really, really special because he was able to give us some firsthand information about how things were done in the group. And one of the shocking things that we discovered, we asked him, like, was there ever any tension in the group? Were there any obstacles? Were there any arguments? This was a racially integrated group, when there weren't any other groups like this, especially in the world of jazz. And we were just so surprised in that in the group's 30-year history, which is rare for a grassroots type of group like this, they never had any kinds of, disagreements, disgruntlements. It was, everyone that was involved was just so passionate about the music and so plugged into celebrating that music and using it as a platform to build community that it just kind of overrode so much of the background noise, I guess, that was happening in the world around them. So it was just a really, really special opportunity for the students.
Thank you. So coming from the classroom perspective, and even being able to connect with people that were part of that original organization, it makes me then kind of think about looking at this from a different angle, maybe with you, Angel, thinking about what it means to come to this region, to call it home, and then to make these connections and inroads to build this kind of trust with the Maryland Traditions Archives.
Absolutely. So one thing that we like to say is that we like to expand our programming at the speed of trust, right? In something that we've in the past, we've actually not done programming in places where it doesn't feel like it's the right fit for us. And we do expand our programming in places where we feel that we can trust the partner that we're operating with, right? In the case of in the case of our organization, we consider ourselves part of the community that's actually going into these spaces to practice our traditions, right? And because of that, we definitely do not want to lose the trust of our organization, of our community, by putting them in those places where they don't feel trusted. If we don't feel trusted, that's the case. In the case of Maryland Traditions Archive, it's been really wonderful to see how they are, careful and caring about the material that we've actually done, or the activity, the work that we've done, and how they've actually preserved it, that we can, obviously in confidence, invite people to go and look at that material and again, as I said before, make the offer to really anybody that wants to talk to us about how we've leveraged it to do that, because it definitely is a caring and trusting partner.
And one of the things that's really striking to me about this idea of building trust is also that shared curatorial authority. And Tiffany, can we ask you this question of you for your response?
Thanks. So the first thing that comes to mind for me when we're talking about trust is transparency, and I think that is key, because like you were saying, with shared stewardship, folks, what they want to know, what their oral histories are being used for, and what narratives are going to be pushed. How are their photos going to be used? So I think you have to be clear in that way. And it also needs to be a symbiotic relationship, not one-sided. If it's just me turning over, these stories or artifacts or what have you, what's the point? Well, I still have access. Well, my family, so we need to look at not only being transparent and look at accessibility, but also again, look at the source communities as the experts, because they are our teachers for us who are actually in there processing these collections. So without trust, it's my assumption that you would have a bunch of documents, objects with a lack of real understanding and what their true meanings are. And again, an outsider's interpretation may be skewed compared to the view of an insider. So without that trust, archivists could be left with a lack of understanding and not really have the real understanding of the subject matter to make, those objects, these stories, these papers in an archive solid source materials, primary materials.
Well, thinking about those comments, I mean, and just really that idea of transparency, what does it mean to have a symbiotic relationship, and ultimately those points of accessibility, those sentiments and everything that we've heard thus far, in my mind, really evokes the word transformation, where we're going from one state into another. And in order for anything to be transformed within our institutions or within communities, that means that we need to be able to identify what those issues might be that need to be transformed, that need to be overcome. And I think that could be a good transition perhaps to our third question. And we can start with Angel with this question, but thinking about what are the kinds of barriers that might exist for source communities that need to be overcome in order to use archives like the Maryland Traditions Archives?
Yeah, I think it was said before, so I'll echo the transparency. I'll add to that accessibility, right? I think that when we actually, as source communities, provide material with the hope and the expectation that it'll be accessible to those that are interested in our traditions, that want to find out if they're in the state of Maryland and whether those traditions are practiced, we would hope and expect that material that we provided to the archive would be accessible to them, right? And I think that if that is the case, then not only accessible to us, but accessible to our communities and accessible to really to anybody that would like to access them is one of the barriers that I would find initially that would need to be overcome in order to have that representation that we expect to have in the archives.
And thinking about some of the things that you were saying, Jenifer, about what's happened with your particular museum, can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the internal barriers that you've had to overcome in order to really engage more fully with communities?
No, absolutely. Well, just to start with the nuts and bolts of it, I mean, we work really hard to provide accessibility as archivists and museum folks. So, we use collections management systems, relational databases, and websites, and those are wonderful tools. I don't think we should overestimate our ability to connect with people, to let people know they exist. The fact that not everyone is comfortable enough with the technology, potentially the language, databases and collections records are imperfect. It can seem like gatekeeping, right? When we don't necessarily have tools and resources that are accessible to all of our users. When they look at us and look at who we are, they may see that this is not, a place where they are represented. So they may immediately feel like they aren't welcome. And then thus we aren't able to collect. And that's a cyclical problem. I think that is a barrier to access as well. And finally, I think that one of the biggest barriers that we have is that time. And it goes back to the building of trust and the collaboration. Creating finding aids, making collections accessible physically or electronically to people is time consuming of professional resources. And we don't always have what we need or the time we need to be open on a regular basis. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to address in order for people to feel like their history is theirs and they can access it at any time.
Thank you for that. And as I'm reflecting on where we've been in our conversations thus far, Tiffany, I think, can you offer some sort of a response and even a counterpoint to what your experiences have been and what you're observing?
Well, I always say that libraries and archives have a PR problem. So I don't think the average person thinks of archives as being accessible to them. And when you think about, cultural traditions, you're talking about your everyday person, So that's one problem. Much less, you're certainly not going to be aware of the variety of services, resources that, archives have to offer folks. And Earl kind of touched on this earlier. We don't teach kids about archives. Most primary and secondary schools, they have libraries, but I've never heard of one that had an archive for folks to, for the students to use. And, we all went to school. I don't ever recall being taught about how to access an archive. And I think that's the first place to start if we really want to normalize the use of archives in a way as a way to access primary sources. And as already mentioned, archives, they tend to be stuffy, even more so than libraries. Again, not the place you think you want to go hang out on a Saturday if they're even open. They don't tend to make people feel welcome. I've experienced that myself going to an archive at one point. Sometimes it's the little things, just education and good customer service to start. That's a good place to start, I think. And then there was also the mention of accessibility, things like parking. I already mentioned hours. Having to give an ID. Not a lot of people, this is my social worker coming out, a lot of people don't have IDs. So that cuts out a lot of people right there. So again, I think we have to think about this more simply. The word itself, institution, is intimidating. So we have to think about better ways we can reach, your average person who isn't involved in academia.
Thank you so much. And I guess, to continue with this trend and focus, what can you add to the conversation on that point?
So introducing students to archival materials is, every time I've done it, most of the class has never interacted with archival materials ever. So it's usually their first interaction, and that happens way too frequently, in my opinion. So that's something that, my own personal soapbox that, I would want for a variety of different kinds of humanities courses, right? But just for speaking from my own personal habits as a scholar and researcher, accessing archives takes a degree of institutional knowledge and know-how, and kind of knowing how to navigate everything from the databases, the finding aids and everything. And if you're not kind of given an orientation to how all of those things work, it can be really intimidating for just, someone who's never engaged anything like that to know how, know who to talk to or know where to look to access all of these things. So finding ways to make, the websites and all the public facing material really accessible, I think is so important and easily overlooked because, it's often put together by people who already have that kind of institutional knowledge that kind of comes second nature. So it really takes an effort to kind of step out of that and really think from the perspective of tailoring these tools for a really, really broad general audience, right? And assuming that they don't have prior knowledge about some of the things that we take for granted, like a finding aid. Some people are like, what is a finding aid? What is that? They don't even know what that is, let alone how to use it, right? So making those things clear, providing definitions of things and not just assuming that people know what the terms mean, right? That are new to this stuff. So simple things like that can go a long way And then when it comes to accessing archives physically, I can't agree more with the comment about, just general customer service, making sure that the spaces are welcoming, that people don't feel like they're going to be interrogated when they come into these spaces. And, and that's not to say that that people are doing that intentionally. It's just one of those differences when you're thinking about audience, right? And what people experience when they come into a space. Right. And there's always good reasons for all of those policies and the way that things get done for, either security reasons or protecting the materials and everything. But really elevating and the concern of like, who are the people that we want to come in? How are they going to experience how we kind of unravel and unfold this space for them is a really, really important conversation to have. On behalf of the folks who are running these spaces.
That's powerful. It's interesting from my vantage point, working both, having experience working both within institutions and then working to better serve the communities that I'm a part of or those that I collaborate with. There's this question that keeps coming up when we're thinking about archival collections. First of all, what do we have, and what are the ways in which people might want to receive it? And I'm really struck by also the phrase of, archives have a PR problem. When I think about the complexity of the work that goes into it, there are issues that impact both institutions and communities with the things that we want to preserve. What is the physical state that they're in? How do we think about, humidity, temperature, managing mold and pests to keep people safe, just to make the materials safe to access? Where are we going to store them? How are we going to describe them? Are there pathways for digitization so we can really kind of expand what that accessibility looks like online and how we communicate electronically? And all of that, in my years of doing this work, it's really been impactful to think about how this needs to work both within institutions and communities. And I think that really ties into where we want to go with the fourth question, which is, what are the resources and practices that could help people actively use their cultural materials in the Maryland Traditions Archives? And Earl, I'm just really moved by the things that you were just saying, so perhaps you can lead us off with this fourth question.
I think, locking in on a really good advertising strategy could be really, really beneficial, getting the word out in a way that's appealing, that makes these materials seem, accessible, right, to this target audience. And figuring out how to reach those audiences can be tricky, but I think, if we elevate the importance of reaching those audiences with this kind of advertising, I think you'll definitely see a payoff. For example, I know that there's, even just looking at, what we worked on with the Left Bank Jazz Society, if I had more time with, this was only a summer program, so I had kind of a, narrow confines to work with the students. But if we had more time, I would have loved to have done some kind of canvassing or maybe just distribution of a large survey to kind of find folks who went to some of these events that were held by the Left Bank Jazz Society, to see what experiences they had with it, or materials that they may have kept from those concerts, that we could then connect them with the materials that we have at UMBC, right? If we had more time, it would have been really, really cool to think about, okay, well, how do we find those folks, and how can we make this really rich resource that we have available to them? Maybe we need to go, attend some jazz concerts around the area just to see how do we find these people again, right? So thinking creatively like that, I think are going to have to, that will have to be included in some of these more strategic and creative communication plans.
Excellent. Thank you. Angel, can we turn the mic over to you to respond to this question about resources and practices that could help?
Sure. I think that, I think at the end of the day, what is in the Maryland Traditions Archive can be generalized as information, right? And I think when it comes to information and people looking for information, the world went online. It's the first place that everybody goes to. I think that making the public-facing door for the Maryland Traditions Archive bigger and easier to access would be something that I think would be very beneficial in order to get more people to find it, to be able to access the information in there. And obviously, when you find information that's of value to you, you'll definitely get in your car if need be, and actually stop by the actual physical location. But I think that would be something that I would recommend highly, right? Putting effort and resources towards going really where everybody else is. I think this webinar was a fantastic idea. The fact that it was promoted on Facebook. Again, this is where everybody's currently living, for better or for worse, right? So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. And thinking about, Jenifer, to you, thinking about the resource center and facility that you help to manage, how do resources and practices fit into where things might go with you?
Everyone has really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think that the awareness is first and foremost. I think what is most important to getting people to our archive, whether they're accessing it online through our portal, and we have a practice now of pushing out, highlights from our collection on social media. We haven't always done that. Now we're linking back to our portal. We're saying, you can find out more information here. And what has happened as a result of that is not only are people using and then the portal using our records and then coming to us for further research, but they're also then saying, hey, I have more information that relates to this. So it's actually helping us to build our collections. The other thing that Greg, you really pointed out here is that digitization in this world is key. Digitization is very resource intensive, and we're all working toward it, and we will never have everything digitized. And I will actually, as a note, just say there is nothing as compelling as being able to see the actual document, photograph, object. I don't want to deprive the next generation of that thrill, but by the same token, digitization of materials, the more that we can do, opens up these collections to people across the world, people who have limitations because of geographic distance, yes, but also physical challenges. Of course, there's many ways we need to improve how we make things available online, but it really opens up a whole new world for us. We're having a lot of success in as Earl mentioned, introducing archives to younger students. We have a summer camp that brings students into the archives to understand how to create an exhibit and do the research for that. We've done work with Maryland History Day. So, reaching out to these existing programs and saying, use our materials, use our resources with field schools through universities. And also just behind the scenes opportunities. We found that the public really actually craves the opportunity to understand what it's like in that dusty archive, and for us to be able to share our enthusiasm and our passion for our work and say, look, it's really not boring. It's really actually exciting. And universally, people are just fascinated to see kind of the what we do, that we have to be technologically savvy, that we're preserving history, that there's all these dynamic and diverse stories hidden behind closed doors, as it were. It really opens up that world to them in new ways. And so if we could do that with everyone, that would be great, but let's start doing it more often in a variety of ways.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And to Tiffany, you got this panel discussion started off on a really powerful foot. We'd love to give you the last word as part of this formal segment of today's webinar. So, go for it.
All right. So, well, hopefully I'll live up to that. So So, again, we got to take it back to basics. We got to remember not everybody's able-bodied. So I'm thinking about where the library is and where that garage is on the UMBC campus. So that would be challenging for say, our elders that want to come check out the collection. So that's something to think about. Also, a lot of community elders, they're not digitally literate. And maybe if they are a little savvy, maybe they don't have a computer, but they have a cell phone. So when we talk about doing finding aids and websites, is that going to be able to, be cell phone ready? Not all sites are. So that's something to consider. And then again, we're talking about an academic library here. We're talking about academia. A lot of people in my community, that's like a foreign word to them. It's a foreign land to be on a campus, So there's that comfort level again. But the thing here that comes to mind for me is community partnerships. And as mentioned by some of the colleagues here, that is huge when it comes to bringing, people that aren't familiar into this world to access archives and to feel comfortable working with them. So I'm thinking of organizations, partnerships with not only the community and subjects of the collections, but with other community organizations who may just be interested in learning about, a certain collection. Area schools could be a participant. Like I mentioned earlier, we know about libraries in primary and secondary schools, but we don't so much talk about archives. And that could easily be worked into a history class. Public libraries, you see all kinds of programming in public libraries too around culture and traditions. Why not, get in ranks with them? And then, there's plenty of other cultural institutions that I think partnerships could be made with. Not only could they assist with spreading the word, but creating programming, creating displays, and really showcasing this collection, for example, the MTA archives, to folks who are unaware and not privy to what's happening in academia.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thinking about just the overall arc of this panel discussion, I think there's many words that come to my mind to describe it, but I think throughout the course of our conversation, there's kind of three words that kept on coming to my mind as I reflect on the things that the four of you are sharing, and that is leadership, and the clear leadership that all of you are providing to identify processes, to identify possibilities. The second word is engagement, and the critical ways that you've been actively involved to make these connections between communities, institutions, and the collections that reside there. And then the last word that really comes to my mind when I think about what the four of you shared is this idea of commitment. What are we committing to doing this work in terms of our professional and personal lives, how we show up for family, how we show up for our students, how we think about this from a cross-generational perspective, and then ultimately, how do we take those three keywords of leadership, engagement, and commitment, and then translate that into the improved PR that we all need to have for archives. And I think about where the Maryland Traditions Archives began, with kind of that genesis moment back in 1967 to where it's going now after 10 years at UMBC. There's a lot of powerful things that are taking place, and I'm really glad that we get to have this discussion. And as we transition to the Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. But Ryan, as we move into the Q&A, one of the things that I guess I wanted to redirect to you is, after all that you've heard, where do we go from here? And how we can partner with you and Lorraine and support the work that's happening at UMBC, and how we can support the ongoing work of the Maryland Traditions Program and the Maryland State Arts Council.
That is the billion-dollar question, is it not? And before responding to that, I want to thank you all panelists so much for such a thoughtful and engaged series of conversations. It's fun to sit back and kind of listen to how they braid one into another's, your various experiences and types of engagement and community relationships there connect one to another. So thank you all so much, very much for that. Very excited to have been able to facilitate this webinar. And I do also want to ensure that Lorraine is able to answer this question that you've just posed us, Greg, the so what next? I often think that it boils down very much to, you know, in order to do the kinds of engagement, in order to do these relationship building, community building, access things, right? There's always that question of capacity. There's always that question of support on the side of the repository. You know, I don't know an archival institution in this world that has too much funding or too much space for their materials to take up or for their staff to do. If that archive exists, we would love to hear about it. Every archival professional in the world would love to hear the secret. But again, I don't think that exists. So those kinds of, you know, kind of on the very, very back end, those institutional support, I think is often what I think of the most of a so what next. Lorraine, I don't know if you want to chime in here, and I see Beth is still with us. Beth, I don't know if you want to join in as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. Beth Saunders. Yes, monetary support is always welcome. Capacity building, sure. But I mean, I think honestly, just using the collections is the #1 thing that we're looking for, and using the collections is a form of support for them. One, it helps us show their worth to, you know, people who do have the capacity to give us funding. But two, it helps us to learn about the collections, to better describe them, and to think of new connections to the communities. It's sort of an iterative process. The more people who engage with them, the more we know about them, the more that we can get things digitized and out so that more people are interacting. And yeah, so I think supportive in that way. And then I think hopefully there are some people listening who are tradition bearers in the community, and just being aware that this resource is here. If you've ever, you know, been sitting on materials that you wondered, is there a place, you know, that would preserve these? Does this have to be, you know, I'm handing these down to my children and it's going to be their problem. These things have value. We accept donations. I and Ryan, you know, both of us, you can reach out to discuss possibilities. And, you know, if you want to keep your materials, we're also very much, you know, working on arrangements like we have with the Folklife centers, where you keep your materials, and to some extent, you know, capacity allowing, we can keep digital surrogates or inventories, that sort of thing. So there's lots of possibilities there.
Thank you so much for chiming in there, Beth. I want to cue to you, Lorraine, before we open to the broader audience, and you beat me to it. My apologies for interrupting.
Oh, no problem. Just quickly, from an archivist perspective, I think that within the last 10 years, even an archivist's approach to a collection like this has completely transitioned. Not completely, still transitioning, but is transitioning, right? So it's less of a transaction and more of a, you know, a collaboration, sort of a ongoing conversation between those who are transferring or donating materials and me, not necessarily a representative of the institution, right? But as someone who cares about the materials that you are bringing to the institution, and how you would, you know, having that kind of back and forth of the care, the importance, the specific highlights of what makes the collection, right? And I think that the what next is just expanding that more to what Tiffany was saying. I mean, Tiffany wasn't just an intern in our special collection. She actually created the blueprint for an outreach activity that is happening this weekend just from that internship opportunity. She was the best person to kind of do that internship because she is a member of the Lumbee community. It's these specific points that we are starting to pay more attention to, because there's no way that I can create descriptions, but there's no way that I can create a description the same way and with the same knowledge that Tiffany would, or that Ashley Minner, the founder of the collection, would. And so I think there is a shift in the mindset for how institutions, how archivists are actually interacting with donors in themselves. That's my spiel.
That's a great spiel, and thank you both so much for chiming in. We have about 10 minutes, maybe not quite 10 minutes left with you today during this webinar, and I'd love to open up to your broader questions. Please feel invited to pop them into the chat if you prefer. There is a raise hand feature, a little icon with a handprint on it in the bottom center right of your screen. Feel free to use that if you want to ask a question, and I see that Jill has one. Jill, please feel invited to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm popping in and out because I was also I wanted to attend the panel where they're discussing the application of another organization I work with. But I wanted, maybe you've already discussed this, but to focus on how do you get this material out of the archives and out of the practice mode of the traditions into the classrooms in Baltimore, in Maryland. I've thought of, and I wanted particularly to mention this to Dr. Brooks. You may be aware of the archive music collections at the Peabody Library, A Storm is Passing Over and Sounds and Stories, that were put together by archivist Elizabeth Schaff around 2000, and they're now online in the George Peabody Library collection. And I've thought for some time that it would be, how do we get those materials out of the archives and into the classroom? I've made Baltimore City music teachers, for example, aware of them, but really what it would take for them to use them would be, to have actual lesson plans that use the interviews, oral histories, and music and photographs in that archive in the correct curriculum. And I know that Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore worked with the Department of Education when they were being founded to try to create lessons connecting their collection to curriculum and doing workshops for teachers. And I just feel like that's a big piece that needs to happen. Whether it's the jazz tradition in Left Bank or any of the other traditions that were being discussed today.
Thank you so much for that, Jill. Earl, do you want to respond to that, or any other of our panelists?
Sure, I'll respond. Thank you so much, Jill, for your comments. And no, I disagree. It can be kind of a logistical challenge for some instructors, depending on what kind of archival material you want your course to engage, and if those materials have been fully digitized. And if the materials are digitized, then it makes it a lot easier, because you can just pull everything up in class, and then the students can access it whenever they need to on their own if they're doing an assignment or something like that. But if it requires a physical site visit, then that obviously can make things a lot more complicated in terms of just getting the kids over there. I was really, really fortunate in that, the Left Bank Society jazz materials were right on campus. So, I could have the students go right into the special collections and work with the materials. And we didn't have to use any resources on travel or anything like that. So So I say all that to say that, anytime that the materials are digitized, it's going to make it a lot easier for instructors to access them. Now, there are some workarounds that can be done. If you are in a situation where, let's say, there's some archival materials that are in, another archive that's too far to take students, and those materials have not yet been digitized, which is very common, right? There are some workarounds that you can do. I've been in situations where I've hired local folks who have some experience with that particular archive to go in and take pictures of those materials for me, right? And then I have a digital copy, as long as they're following whatever the policies are for that particular archive around taking photos. So there's things you can do to get around some of the barriers with access if the instructors have the support of their institutions.
Yeah,
Thank you so
yes,
much.
I just want to, if I could respond really quickly, Ryan, I don't want to take
Well,
up.
I'm actually, Jill, my apologies. Because we're running out of time, I do want to have a few other questions. So if you wouldn't mind adding your question into the chat, and if we have time at the end, we'll get to that. I do also want to draw attention to the fact that our colleague David Lewis from Library of Congress added into the chat, specifically relating to Jill's question, a resource that some folks might already be familiar with about teaching with primary sources in humanities classrooms, with some recommendations on how that could be tweaked for K through 12 or general public and community-based research, outreach, in addition to other contexts as well. And we'll note that there are a couple of other of our peer repositories around, for example, the Maryland State Archives, that are doing comparable work with this, specifically designing curricula to accompany archival materials so they can more easily be plugged into public contexts, whether in specifically K through 12, university, or other community contexts. Again, because of the amount of time, I do want to pivot possibly to one last question, just because of the time. Cheryl Dowdy, your hand is raised. Please unmute, introduce yourselves, and ask your question.
Hi, I am a tradition bearer with the Pocomoke Indian Nation, and I did want to mention, in response to the question on the table, Maryland Humanities has done a lot of work with using primary source documents and links to find them in archives in various places for teacher lesson plans. And the Maryland Center of History and Culture has some teaching tools as well, where they have developed and linked to primary source documents. So those are a couple of things going on that I'm aware of. But mainly I wanted to say thank you all. Your comments today have re-energized me one more time, because as a person of Indigenous heritage with a mission to preserve it, so many things you said were respectful and uplifting, and we can't wait to do more of those sorts of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, very, very much, Cheryl. That's very kind of you, and always deeply appreciated to receive that kind of feedback, and also to receive feedback that has also might have criticisms or requests to do better. Those kinds of feedback are always welcome, and we hope folks will feel invited to share any and all of the above. My clock says that it is 1:30 on the dot. That is our total allotted time today. Thank you again to our panelists for taking the time, both during today's actual webinar and in the conversations that preceded it and resulted in its planning. Deeply grateful to you all. Thank you, Greg, for moderating and for being so thoughtful and helping us put this together. Thanks to Lorraine and Beth and the other of our colleagues at UMBC. Today's webinar is being recorded, and that recording will very soon, probably next week, be living on MSAC's YouTube channel. So we hope you will check it out there. In the meantime, folks, thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, morning, and/or evening.